think my audio. Audio?
Okay. All right, I think we could go ahead and get started. We have quite a few folks here and we'll let anyone else in as they arrive. First of all, thank you guys all for coming. This is fantastic. The new crazy world of Zoom events is a strange landscape, but it's wonderful to see so many faces here. My name is Adrienne Myers. I'm a promotions manager at the University of Chicago Press, and I work with our fantastic Phoenix Poets series. And we will have the honor of hearing from two of our most recent poets tonight. So today we will have Rachel DeWoskin and Gail Mazer joining us. From the University of Chicago's Phoenix Poet series. I also want to thank our event co-host, the Seminary Co-op, and I'll be posting a link in the chat to their website where you can purchase both of these books. Also be sure to check out their other upcoming events, along with events in the press's new By the Book series. I'll post a link to that series link as well. All right, so first off, I'll introduce Gail and Rachel to you all. Then we'll have each of them read some poems, and after that, we'll have time to take questions from you. Once we get time for questions, if you'll just pop your question in the chat, then we'll read it out and let Gail and Rachel respond. Okay, let me see if anyone else needs to be let in before I introduce our lovely poets. It looks like we are good. All right, so
Is it?
our first.
Can you hear me? Is my
Yes.
is oh okay, thank you. I can't see my picture. I don't know what I'm doing something wrong, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, don't worry about it. And we'll probably have everyone mute their mics during the reading just so we don't get too much weird ambient noise throwing things off. All right, so our first poet tonight is Rachel DeWoskin. She's the author of 5 critically acclaimed novels, Banshee, Someday We Will Fly, Blind, Big Girl Small, and Repeat After Me, and the author of the memoir Foreign Babes in Beijing, which is based on the years she spent in Beijing as the unlikely star of a Chinese soap opera. Her books have won many awards, including from the National Book Award, Sidney Taylor Book Award, American Library Association's Alex Award, and they've been included in Book of the Year suggestions from Tablet Magazine, Kirkus, and Forward Magazine, and have been chosen as Library Guild selections. She is an associate professor of practice and practice in arts at the University of Chicago and an affiliated faculty member in Jewish and East Asian studies. Her poetry collection, Two Menus, was just published with the University of Chicago Press this spring. Gail Mazer is the founder of the Blacksmith Poetry House Reading Series, one of the oldest continuous series in the country. She is taught widely, including in the graduate writing programs of Boston University, Emerson College, and the University of Houston. She has been awarded numerous grants and awards, including from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, and Radcliffe College's Bunting Institute. She's also served as a writer in residence at Emerson College and was the 2005 recipient of the Botolph Club Foundation's Distinguished Artist Award. She is the author of 8 books of poetry, including The Common, They Can't Take That Away From Me, Zeppo's First Wife, Figures in a Landscape, and Forbidden City, all of which the University of Chicago Press was lucky enough to publish. They Can't Take That Away From Me was a finalist for the National Book Award, and Zeppo's First Wife was a finalist for both the Patterson Poetry Prize and the Los Angeles Times Poetry Prize, and was the winner of the Massachusetts Book Prize. Land's End, her latest collection of new and selected poems, has also just published from the University of Chicago Press. So with these admittedly abbreviated introductions, both of these poets have a long list of accolades. We will kick off the event with Rachel reading some of her work.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a giddy honor to be reading with Gail. I have been following Gail's beautiful career since I was in my 20s in graduate school, and my best friends from graduate school, including Fred Spears, the wonderful poet, are here in the room. Gail, we've been going to your readings for 20 years, so giving one with you is a giant joy. I also should say that one of the first readings I ever gave as a writer was at the Blacksmith House. And it was one of the most magical nights of my young life. I read from my first book in 2005, and being in the Blacksmith House was like, I don't know, it was like being in room 222 at Boston University or something. I just felt all the poets there and the years and years of beautiful work being read, and being part of that was a major honor for me. So this feels poetic. I'm on my windowsill in Chicago. And I'm gonna read 6 poems, each one under 2 minutes, just so you know what to expect. The first poem is called The Blind Massage Parlor. The Blind Massage Parlor. Doctors Han and Wang run the Love Heart Massage in one of Beijing's 2.5 billion broken alleys. You'll recognize it by the red awning, Dr. Han says on the phone. And when I do, I wonder who told him. Later, on one immaculate bed in a row of 7, I feel Dr. Han's fist wedged between 2 innocent bones in my shoulder. He accompanies the soundtrack of my gasping with a simple statement: we hated Titanic. I shift my weight on the straight white table and arch my eyebrows, a gesture Dr. Han overhears. He rests his right hand for one thoughtful moment on my spine and explains, the story was stupid with its music. Your American Hollywood knows what about love? Nothing in that movie fit. I make shy eye contact with a client in a bed across the row. We are the only 2 here today. I think she loves Titanic, from the delicate way she lifts her neck to look at me, confused. I smile and replace my face into the massage table's dark space. Maybe Drs. Han and Wang also smile at each other over us, because Dr. Han says, we've been married for 18 years. We feel what other people just see. Only after Dr. Wang, his wife of 18 years, giggles like a movie star in love, does he turn his attention and hands back to me. These days we have a lot of foreign clients, he remarks. How do you say in English, does this hurt? This next poem is the title poem, 2 menus. 2 menus. Outside McDonald's downtown in Beijing, I board a bus bound for mountains with Xiao Dai, who carries equipment, asks why I have to be so headstrong. I say nothing. We belong to a climbing club, sheer rocks. It is better to be the head of a chicken than the tail of an ox. Men mention wisdom whenever I disagree with them. I am roped in, belayed. If we fall, we all fall. My fingers are between a thin ridge, sideways gripping. I lean down to tell Xiao Dai it's better to be neither chicken nor ox. He can't hear me. The rope swings, flicking sparks off cliffs. Translation is insurance. With just enough to cover what we must, we speak only where there's overlap. Conserve our syllables, expressions, every move. The restaurant in Beijing, called Bitterness and Happiness, has 2 menus. The first of excess, second, scarcity. We order flesh from one and from the other, grass. The Chinese language has 77,000 characters Xiao Dai regards as evidence. When I ask of what, he is putting roots on my plate. Love, he says. My footing gets rocky around these matters of fact. A word for each affair. The waiter's back. This poem is called Housekeeping. Housekeeping. A frog lives under dirt with spiders, chicken-sized and violent, chicken eating even, but they love this game frog. Fetch him water, keep him in a safe, dark corner with their fangs, protect him well until, well, what is it happens to a frog? Kenny Rogers sang it country. There is someone for everyone, turns out. Even in the country underground, spiders hunt fast, meaty prey in packs, return at night to eat their babies taste like chicken, but they never eat the sweet frog. Maybe love's a prison, green frog sweeper, insect cleaner, ants, ticks, mites, Enormous spiders dislike the tickly bugs he eats. Not movie-worthy love, perhaps, but something workable, domestic. Virgin marriage, homespun web, no swimming, buzzing, no flies land from blue onto your outstretched tongue, no lily pads for you, no leaping. Beloved frog, you are the very definition of a pet. Eat your grief quick, keep kept. This poem is called Without. Teach me to love without irony or violence, and I'll sing you a city with waves on the drive, like icy chimes. Listen. How many notes shatter as they reach the shore? Cold enough, water actually stacks. Get in with me, freeze, suffer, thaw. Let me love you without believing as I used to that we're safe, may last. Instead, let's peel, strip raw, find what matters, move against each other and whatever this is. If I could dissolve the words I use to hide, I would, write you hovering above me. Tubes moving fluid from wounds I could not see without the lights in my mind shorting. They short here too, go black. And yet you looked, took those drains on, stripped them, tackled the project of my body by way of language, measured, counted milligram chances, wishing to statistic us straight back to the other oblivion. You stayed you after magicians sawed me open, sewed me back together. You kept all that we agreed on when we, stunningly young, said no matter what. Who knows what becomes? How vast, cold, hot, impossible, how much of our own blood, in plastic bulbs or moving through us, submerged, blue. Teach me to love the way you do, white tape, clean gauze. Let me see endless, see so many hazy days now clearing. Now the lake is ice again, now winter. Frozen waves are chipping at each other, sharp and gray. But high up we are dancing, reassembled, brave because surprise keeps us, our minds and marrow lit, alive. And this is the last poem in the collection, and it's the last one I'm gonna read. And it's called Two, T-O-O, Two. Sing a song of sense, this surface of the lake, roiling water, lolling cusp of summer, maybe dawning wonder we are late to join, chorus of us, women, spackled, rageful, racked. We sparkle, undercurrents of unutterable language coming up, come up. From buried, sunk, from fear, link words, make stable something, here. When we don't, when we do, when this, when shut up, when beat wordless, when we're silent with what's senseless, bound toward dirt, erased, diminished. When we erase to sleep, swim, cope, when we learn how to choke down rage, pain, want, when not allowed to name, when eating is a failure, when we breathe or speak, when daring, flawed, disgusting, or averting to, when to, then flee it, flee. Come with us, ride this grief, ride pride to some reach safe from eating our own, from hunting what we never meant to be, mean it. Don't pack words in your furious marrow, shout out what we made, language, all the babies, hell, ourselves. Thank you.
So much. All right, we're gonna turn it over to Gail now to read some of her poems. Hey, Gail, I think you're on mute. There you go.
I was being a good citizen.
Well, your time to shine is now.
Okay, thank you. The first poem I'm going to read is called Elephant Memory. And it's true. It's set in Cambridge, not far from the campus of Harvard, to which I do not belong. Pragmatic realists, my friend and I are out strolling along Mass Ave one reasonable, seasonable November morning, and all of a sudden, a colossal elephant ambles slowly in our direction, padding north on its own. Past the modernist law school dorms, past the Montrose Spa and the package store, past the blinking traffic light and the credit union, past us, a peaceable giant a prodigiously long way from its exotic home, trotting our mundane macadam. Dolorous, like elephants I've read about, who don't forget their dreadful griefs and losses, the slaughter of their kin. Maybe it's myth they bury their dead, then travel back many miles together to mourn on anniversaries. Mystics, melancholy mystics. Tears of the elephants, tears at the grave sites, trumpeting lamentations, the somber grandeur of their jungle yard sites. Foundations of the Natural History Museum begin to shake. The ingenious, delicate glass irises tremble. A gorilla's threadbare stitching splits. Kapok's afloat in the airless hall of grand mammals. A stuffed ibis wakes and grunts to a dead egret in ancient Greek. What algorithm leads a descendant of mammoths to journey where? Unhurriedly through Harvard Square? What on earth can we make of this sudden elephantine apparition, this unlikely hallucination Lloyd and I are sharing? Well, as Saramago said, it's not every day an elephant appears in our lives. Grounded in our concrete terrain, we stand there, humbled, as it sways deliberately toward Arlington, leaving the two of us behind. No one with any sense wants to be put in a poem, but that elephant's been asking for it for 20 years. Hall Mirror, which is the first poem in the new part of my selected. Hall Mirror. Federal style, 2 small chips in the gilt frame, found at a flea market in the Eisenhower 50s. 19th century American, lovingly refinished, loving gift of my mother. It's too good for you, so take care of it. Some winter mornings here, the taut, lit face of Ethel Rosenberg, or the ecstatic face of Blake. Punim of my 6-year-old grandmother, arriving stunned and mute from Vilna, her big sister Lena, waiting, who knew what was at stake. Oh, my fierce mother, sanding away at the kitchen table, protected by newspapers, the Herald, the Forward, the Traveler, her little brush, her jar of paste, preserving and inventing the past. For what? For me. For today, half-conscious glimpse of myself on my way out for a walk in February snow with a friend or alone. My blue woolen hat, my mirror smile. My American poem. And I'm addressing my husband, Michael. Your uncle was a Trotskyite, mine a Stalinist. We'd idealized them as we grew up, although, or because, they made our parents uneasy, apprehensive. When we fell in love only a few years after the McCarthy hearings, we were so ignorant we thought our uncles would like to meet. In Washington, where Allen had worked for state, the senator from Wisconsin shattered my uncle's life. Online recently, I found the photos of him testifying or refusing to. I don't know, the caption didn't say. Your Harold loathed Stalin, who had Trotsky murdered, lost his faith in Mao, in communism, and gained the world. During the war, he was the Newsweek correspondent on the Burma Trail. Mine somehow clung for a long time to his belief in the Red Tsar and did not gain the world. He was a good man, funny, loving, a reader. During the hearings, daily newspapers had to be hidden from my grandmother, who'd fled the Cossacks. For a time, her fear was the family atmosphere. Humane, musical, brilliant, having been entrapped. Before he died, Alan was gladdened by glasnost. Both of them must have liked that we idealized them. Our cousins surely took their parents' heroism for granted. Mine loved that I wrote poetry. He read poems. He liked talking with me about poems. But he didn't really want to hear about Oshit Mandelstam, didn't believe hope against hope or hope abandoned. A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic, Joseph Stalin. Yours became a China hand, a professor, and had a swimming pool. During Vietnam, he was disgusted by our anti-war mishegas. His first book was called The Tragedy of the Chinese Revolution. His second, No Peace for Asia. You were a punner from your first clutch of words. At 12, you presented your parents with the book you'd written, No Peace for Mazer. Trotsky wrote an enthusiastic preface to Tragedy, though in the later revised edition, the preface was cut. They both loved poetry, yours to write it, mine to read it. He was proud of me. He made that clear. One Thanksgiving, my brother at the piano and Alan on flute played Greensleeves. What have you learned? What do you know? He'd ask whenever we talked. Usually I was speechless, sure he'd be disappointed in me. When King was murdered, we called my uncle to help the Black GE workers. Their union had been denied the right to take the day off for the funeral. He won it for them. It took some years after we married, when I'd grown up and read history, for me to realize if Alan and Harold hadn't managed to not meet at our wedding or ever, they'd have been mortal enemies. But that's what we wanted then, for our heroes to meet. That's how little we knew. Mount Fuji. Hokusai and Hiroshige, my first presents to you. 2 linen-bound books that closed with looped ribbons and faux ivory clasps. Decades later, we gaped at Fuji from a window of Japan Air and gasped together in Narita, a park so immaculate, white rocks gleamed graphic in a river of gravel. Later still, you'd move between the floating worlds of ukiyo-e woodcuts and Chinese landscapes whose surfaces entered you as if it had been fated. A draftsman's draftsman, Hokusai at 70 thought he'd begun to grasp the structures of birds and beasts, insects and fish, of the way plants grow, hoped that by 90 he'd have penetrated to their essential nature. And more, by 100, I will have reached the stage where every dot, every mark I make will be alive. You always loved that resolve, you'd repeat joyfully. Hokusai's utterance of faith in work's possibilities, its reward, that at 110, he'd perhaps have learned to draw. In Edo then, his beloved Fuji was seen as the true source of immortality, as for him it was to be. Will you always give me such spectacular gifts, you asked me that day when we were 20. Forbidden City. Asleep until noon, I'm dreaming we've been granted another year. You're here with me, healthy. Then half awake, the half truth. This is our last day. Life's leaking away again, and this time we know it. Dear body, I hold you pleading, don't leave. But I understand you can't say anything. Who are we? Are we fictional? We don't look like our pictures, don't look like anyone I know. Daylight flickers through a bamboo grove. We approach the Forbidden City, looking together for the hall of fulfilling original wishes. Time is the treasure, you tell me, and the past is its hiding place. I instruct our fictional children. The past is the treasure. Time is its hiding place. If we told him how much we love him, how much we miss him, he could stay. But now you've taken me back to Loyang, to the garden of solitary joy, over 1,000 years old. I wake, I hold your hand, you let me go. Figures in a landscape. We were two figures in a landscape in the middle distance in summer. In the foreground, twisty olive trees, a mild wind made the little dry leaves tremble. Then, of course, the horizon, the radiant blue sky. The maker was hungry for light, light silver the leaves, a stream. I like to think for your sake, the scene was Italian, 17th century. Viewed from here, we resembled one another, though in truth we were unalike, and we were tiny. He kept us small, so the painting would be landscape, not anecdote. We were made things, deftly assembled, but beginning to show where. You, muscular, sculptural, and I was I. We were different. We had a story. On good days, we found comedy in that, pratfalls, and also great sadness. Sun moved across the sky and lowered until you, then I, were in shadow, bereft. The Renaissance had ended. We'd long known we were mortal. In shadow, I held the wild daisies and cosmos we'd been gathering for the table. Then the sky behind us pinked and inflamed the landscape, where we were left to our own reinvention, two silhouettes who still had places they meant to travel, who were not abstractions. Had you pricked them, they'd have bled alizarin crimson. I wanted to walk by myself a while, but I'd always been afraid to lose you, and the naked olive groves were hovering as if to surround you. That was the problem. I craved loneliness. I needed the warmth of love. If no one looks at us, do we or don't we disappear? The landscape would survive without us. When you're in it, it's not landscape, any more than the horizon's a line you can stand on. And my last poem is called Blue Work Shirt, and it's short. Blue work shirt. I go into our bedroom closet with its one blue work shirt, the cuffs frayed, the paint stains, a loopy non-narrative of color, of spirit. Now that you are bodiless and my body's no longer the body you knew, it's good to be reminded every morning of the great mess, the brio of art making. On the floor, the splattered clogs you called your Pollock shoes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail and Rachel both. Little claps from everybody. We can now open things up to questions. So first I want to ask though, Gail and Rachel, if you have any questions for each other. And during that time, if anyone else wants to pop questions into the chat, then I will call on you once your question is up.
I did want to ask Rachel to expand on a line in one of her poems, which I thought was really important. I will retreat to rhyme. And what rhyme means to you, because you use it so deftly and brilliantly. in a lot of your poems.
Oh, I love that question. Before I answer, let me just tell you the line I'm asking you about, because it's on page 105. And it's the final line of the woman poem, The Women in Your Family. And you say, in this minute, almost free to express it. And I wanted to ask you about almost. So I feel like the two questions are related and my answer might be related, because for me, rhyme is the opposite of almost. It's
Rhyme is the opposite of prose.
It's the opposite of almost.
Oh,
It's like the arrival at something certain and lovely and safe. And even when I was a little kid and I got rhyme, I think I say in that poem, I'm ashamed, but I should admit it proudly, that I learned to rhyme from Billy Joel and Sylvia Plath. And I've always felt about rhyme like it corrects for some kind of chaos that I find unbearable. And I've been thinking about this during the plague, because all I want to write these days are sonnets. I've written nothing but sonnets for 7 months. No prose, no free verse, nothing else. I can't write nonfiction. I've put my novels aside. And sonnets feel to me comforting because of the certainty of the rhyme scheme. And every time I land a line, I feel like, okay, at least over here, I have this beautiful, precise unit. And it's the opposite of my own feelings of disorder.
that's so interesting. Well, you have such a gifted and original way of using rhyme that, you know, I had read a lot of poems before I realized what I was seeing. And my almost is just, it would only be in a poem called To the Women of My Family, you know, almost free to express myself.
I feel like a lot of your poems have this kind of like a surface tension, a kind of feeling that you're saying something and underneath it there are layers and layers of other things that are suggested by the poems. Of course, this is good. This is true of a lot of good poetry. Can I ask you one more question that's much broader before we open up? Is that okay, Adrienne? Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to know what it feels like to have a book with this kind of sweep and scope, both what it feels like in terms of how you make poems, whether the process of making poems for you is the same as it was in the earliest of these poems, or if not, how it's changed, and how you put together a book like this with this many places and this many eras in it. Like, I mean, I guess I can be a little bit more specific just by saying, like, that last line of the last poem is so amazing. And I wonder, like, did you decide to put that poem last because of that final line? What was the genesis of the shape of this selected?
What is you mean the baseball poem?
Yeah, the last line of the baseball poem, "The wind keeps carrying my words away."
Well, the funny thing is that the baseball poem is the only poem that I kept for my first book, just because I was constantly being made to make things shorter, not because I didn't want them, but it was a poem that early in my writing life was the first completely free poem, uninhibited, I mean by that uninhibited, that came to me in a rush, 90% finished, without questioning myself. The subject is a great one for writers, baseball, but because it does contain everything. So I guess almost free is is the confession of a socialized person. You know? Does that answer your question without my probing further?
Beautifully.
Excellent. We do have one question in the chat so far from Dory R. It's for Rachel. They asked, Rachel, is Without based on Lake Michigan? As a regular point swimmer, I loved it. So Dory, if you want to unmute yourself and chime in, feel free to.
It is. It's about the way Lake Michigan freezes. I've been stunned to watch the lake in the winter and to see the way the ice literally stacks up at the edge of the lake and the waves get slow and they overlap in this completely astonishing way. Of course, it's out my bedroom window. That's part of the reason I decided to read that poem. It's one of my Chicago poems. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Anyone else has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But kind of building on that, I wanted to ask both of you, I had wanted to ask you both about how sense of place informs your work, since place is so central to each of these collections. And then interestingly enough, in the sort of chatting time before the event started, the first thing we start talking about is the cities that we're in and how they feel right now in the fall and what our favorite things are, where we go. So if either of you have any notes about that, I'd love to hear it.
I do think that just the phrase "a sense of place" has always been powerful for me, and I do think maybe because, you know, by the time I was in my late 20s, I had moved sort of back home, but to Cambridge, not to the suburb that I grew up in, and I'm very much a sort of Massachusetts person, and when I've traveled, it's powerful because I don't travel that much. So the time that I spent in China, which was like, I think if I did the math, it would be 1/1000th the time that Rachel, no, 1/500,000th the time that Rachel has spent there. Everything was interesting and sort of stayed with me as part of my experience because I don't travel that much. But for me, so much of my writing is rooted in place. I can't really get away from it. Even my long baseball poem is rooted in Fenway Park, even though it doesn't say so.
For me, place it's more of an almost, I would say, than it is a rhyme. In a funny way, displacement is a crutch for me. I prefer to be away from the place I'm writing about, and distance gives me clarity. So my favorite Chinese expression is 井底之蛙, the frog in the bottom of the well, who looks up and thinks that it can see the whole expanse of heaven, but can actually just see a circle. And I have that problem. So when I'm in a place, I actually have a little bit of trouble seeing it with clarity or experiencing it with clarity. And I think partly because I moved to Beijing when I was so young, my perspective about America and really my perspective about myself comes from feeling like an outsider and imagining the ways in which other people were viewing me. I think I felt for most of my 20s, not like the protagonist, more like an extra, and I was often viewing myself externally or trying to view myself externally. And that made my writing a little bit more lucid in some way. And when I came back to America, I decided to be a poet because of Robert Pinsky, who's in the room, because his work was so unbelievably clear and good and narrative. And it was often, for me, American in this very democratic and beautifully articulate way. And I decided I wanted to go back to America and learn English in Robert's classroom, which is what I did. And it wasn't until I arrived back in America and lived for the first time in my life in Boston that I was able to write about China, or even able to percolate the many things I had observed while there. I started in those years in graduate school translating Chinese poetry, both Tang poetry, which I translate with my dad now. My dad is a China scholar, and also Chinese rap. And it was my distance from China that allowed for that. And when I left New York and moved to Chicago, I was able to write about New York with a little bit more clarity. And I'm trying now to write about Chicago, even though I live here. So Lake Michigan occurring sometimes, but I think mainly my perspective on a place is made better when I'm external to that place.
Thank you both for that. We have a question from Chiku Reddy. Chiku says, I love the moment when the Mazur says, we feel what others only see, or something like that. Can you say something about the priority of feeling over seeing in that line as it relates or doesn't to your own work? And this is a question for both Gail and Rachel.
Oh, I thought it was for Rachel and my mind drifted. Feeling and seeing.
Yeah, the priority of feeling over seeing. And Chiku, if you want to unmute yourself and elaborate.
I think, well, I know that one doesn't want to write baldly about feeling with no imagery, and seeing is the way to make something of it.
Hi, Chiku.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Gail.
That's okay.
You can talk about Chinese rap if you'd rather.
Hi, Chiku. So that when the blind Mazur said that thing about Titanic to me in my 20s, it was the first moment of my lifelong fascination with questions of blindness, actually. I wrote a novel. One of my novels is about a young person who loses her eyesight and has to recalibrate how she's going to make meaning of the world via her other senses. And my senses are an absolute kind of crisscrossed spider web. So I see colors. I had, the way music sounds looks like something particular to me. Words taste like different things. And until I was in college, I thought that was just how everybody experienced everything. And in fact, it was in Kenneth Koch's class, a lecture hall, where he asked us to raise our hands if I can't remember if it was agreed or disagreed with some poem. I want to say Apollinaire, a poem about the colors of the days. And I remember thinking that the colors of the days were wrong because I knew that Monday was white and Tuesday was blue and Wednesday was yellow and so on. And that this was kind of a joke, like a kind of knowing the convention and thwarting it in the poem. And then Koch asked who has colors for the days, and only two of us raised our hands. And it was this astonishing kind of nightmarish revelation for me. First of all, I was really embarrassed because I was an undergraduate student and I felt it was embarrassing to have raised my hand about this. But I also had never realized that we didn't all agree on those rules. And so one of my central curiosities, which runs through all my work, is this question of how we see things and how our visions of things differ depending on who we are. And when the massage parlor guy, when Dr. Hahn said that thing to me, I thought, well, that's really interesting. He watched Titanic, he hated it and thought it was stupid. And he has a deeper sense of it than I do. And he's just using senses that are not his vision in order to have this, to make this kind of meaning of it. I found that really, really compelling, that idea. And I think it's possible. I don't think that feeling is kind of overwhelms seeing, but I think that most of our experiences, both in the world as human beings and in writing, both when we make it and when we read it, are these weird kind of, I don't know, they're like these interwoven, very, very complicated webs of vision and feeling and hearing and seeing and sensing. And of course, I think of Samurai Song too. I think of the line about, I have no priest, my tongue is my choir. And the notion that poetry has to be heard, it has to be read out loud. You don't have to see it. You can also hear it in order to feel it.
Great. We have a question from Megan Marshall. Can you both say something about influences, and maybe especially writers whose example keeps you going now?
I suppose my first influences as an adult, and there was a sort of gap between becoming an adult and starting to write poetry, were local, which meant that the magical duo of Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell were profound influences, and Elizabeth Bishop's cool eye was just it ties into what your earlier question, she was so brilliant at description and low but as I sort of grew up in that, there were just enormous numbers. Somebody wrote me today that they would never forget my saying, reading Jack Gilbert, there's something brilliant on every page. And I thought, I read Jack Gilbert, it was, but you start to devour poetry, and it all influences you. And certainly the poetry of my friends like Rachel's teacher, Robert, and Lloyd Schwartz, and a lot of the poems of people that I've invited to read and learned from. I think in a way you never stop being, if not influenced, then provoked and stimulated, which I think is more the way I think of it as learning. I mean, we sort of get to sort of cannibalize and grab from everything we read a way of stimulating ourselves into poetry. But certainly, I love the exuberance of Jerry Stern. But I wouldn't say Jerry Stern was my big influence. I don't know if I'd say that about anybody. People associate us regionally with different poets. Rachel, you must also have been very influenced by Chinese poetry when you started translating it.
It's true. I love the efficiency and the kind of diamondized way in which Tang poems present this tiny, perfect rectangle on the page, or this little square, and then underneath each character is 1,000 other possibilities. There's something about the lyrical efficiency of Tang poetry that I find mesmerizing, and it's almost impossible to duplicate in English, which is why translating it is kind of a self-flagellating hobby. I think too of the poems that my parents read me when I was a kid. My mom taught American literature and read me Langston Hughes, read me Gwendolyn Brooks, whose poems have mattered to me enormously over the course of my life as a reader and later as a writer. I loved Emily Dickinson as a kid. Read Anne Carson. I found Anne Carson's poetry at the Grolier when I was 26 and wandering around, and it bent my imagination. Autobiography of Red and her Glass essay and Glass, Irony, and God. I've been teaching her books now for 20 years, and so those poems have shifted as I've grown up for me in a way that's very meaningful and important. Yeah, I mean, there must be so many other poets. I remember A.K. Ramanujan's poems. He was at Michigan, where my dad was on the faculty. And I remember reading his poems and then meeting him and realizing, oh, you can be a poet. Like, he made that work. Somehow connecting the human to the page was a massive revelation to me. And then, the work of my two best friends from graduate school, Kiran Kapoor, who has a new book coming out called Women in the Waiting Room, which is one of the loveliest books I've read in 20 years. And Fred Spears, who's in the room, and whose book So Far Afield is beautiful. Their poems have mattered to me in an indescribable way over the last 20 years. We're still finally in a workshop, the three of us. We've been sharing our work for years and years and years, and the way I've watched their work develop has changed my work. And I feel like I have like a tiny Fred and a tiny Kiran in my mind when I write. And so I can imagine the criticisms of my own work and edit preemptively. And I'm interested for my students in making those connections among them so that they keep their pod of poets in perpetuity, because that work matters as much, I think, as the published work that we come to love and admire from afar.
Great. Another question from Dory for Gail. Gail, I was struck by some of the unusual words you use, such as macadam and dolorous. Do you try to use unusual words?
What was the second one?
Dolorous?
Oh, I don't think they're unusual. Macadam is the sort of the, the asphalt paving, and dolorous is. No, I don't ever think that I try to use unusual words, but any more than I do when I'm speaking. It's just, we each have the eccentricities of our vocabularies that come from all these different places in our lives. Probably for me, it came from, reading Louisa May Alcott and Jane Austen and everything when I was in elementary school, and sort of just, we're cannibals. We read like cannibals, so. I'm glad they seem unusual, but I hope they don't seem off-putting. Next. What's happened? Are we frozen?
Sorry, yeah, I think things froze for a second. Were you still answering that one? I think the last bit of it cut off for me. We'll move on. Pamela asked, I'm fascinated by the theme of writing and writing forms as a way of addressing chaos, or as being unable at times to confront chaos. Can each of you elaborate a little bit on this subject, especially at this particular moment in time?
At this particular moment in time, I'm finding it so hard to write that but generally I would say that if you're a writer, writing is your reaction to everything intense or amusing or heartbreaking or historical. It's what I do.
Is this Pamela Ahrens? Is that your question, Pamela? So, I mean, one thing I have to say before I respond is that your book, 11 Hours, gave me a template for one of my novels. I don't know if I've seen you since this happened, but I wrote a novel called Banshee, which is set over 3 weeks. And I wrote it because you liberated me to write it. Like when you came to UChicago a couple of years ago, you said this incredible thing, and it's a response, I think, to your own question right now in a way. You said you were tired of people trying to write big books. Everything had to be big. And when you said this, I was working on this epic war novel and suffering endlessly. I'd been writing for 8 years, and I just felt like I was chewing my tail, and it was so exhausting. And you said, I tried to write a really small book, to take this moment in this woman's life, or these 11 hours, and make a book. And I felt like, oh my God, you can do that. And I loved your book. And I had this feeling then that like a novel could actually be like a poem, kind of in its shape. You could take something that you saw that was utterly distilled, or something that you experienced or felt, Chiku, to go back to your idea about what we see and what we feel, and you could build out from there into this extremely sort of taut and intense form. And that's basically what I've been doing during the plague as well. Taking something like bleaching the groceries, for example, and making it, I hate that. I find it a deeply disturbing and chaotic experience that happens to me 3 times a week or whatever, and making it into a sonnet, which is a small, compact unit, organizes it for me and makes it tolerable, makes it manageable. So in a way, I owe my understanding of the answer to this question to your book. So thank you.
Oh, nice shout outs. Rebecca Morgan Frank has a question for Gail. Can you talk a little about your endings, especially in the longer poems? Do you know where you are headed when you begin, or do you find your way through the act of writing the poem? Maybe the larger question is really the opposite. Where do your poems begin?
No, I don't know where my poem is going when I start. I mean, that's simple. I mean, it's almost a cliche that writing a poem is often an act of discovery, but it is because no matter what you think when you rush to write something because you think you have it, it's going to open up and change and surprise you. And surprise in the writer is one of the great joys of writing, is surprising yourself. What was the rest of that question?
So talking about where poems begin, do you find your way through the act of writing, or is the question, where do they begin, where do they end, and how do you find your way, basically? And also, Rebecca, if you want to unmute yourself. And
yeah, the idea of knowing where it's going to go is almost repels me, actually. I mean, if it isn't an adventure that surprises me, if I knew where it was going, then a lot of the excitement of writing it would almost be like being a stenographer of myself, for myself. But on the other hand, sometimes it will start with the first line that you can't get rid of. It's sort of like a mind worm or something. But I think that's a universal experience for writing poetry, or maybe I just don't know what a universal experience for writing poetry is. Maybe there's no such thing. But it's just great, and it seems to me essential when you surprise yourself in your writing. That to me is the liveliest thing about writing, and it would be boring if I were the stenographer of my thought. The act of writing is provoking, I think.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. So we have one from Suzanne Buffon. Rachel, there's a strong narrative drive in all your work, but where the narratives in your novels generally couldn't be further from your own life's experience, your poems tend to explore extremely personal narratives and intimate forms of dress. Can you talk a little bit about how genre shapes your material, or vice versa? And since you mentioned the safety of rhyme, maybe about the safety versus risk in your work.
I mean, I could ask you the same question. I want to ask about A Pillow Book, how much of it feels risky. I mean, to me, your poems are also extremely risky, and kind of, all of the work, all the poems and all of the novels are actually about kind of my interior life in some way. And so for me, it never divides neatly along kind of, I had this experience and wrote about this experience, like the fiction too, I think most writers write from kind of things we've wondered. I don't usually write about things I know, or things that I'm certain about, or even things that happened to me, either in the prose or the poetry. I think there is a way in which the poems, because they're so shaved down, become more true. And sometimes I find that embarrassing or difficult. I do feel about the poems like there's a vulnerability in the poetry that I feel is easy for me to hide from in my prose. I mean, fiction has the obvious safety net of being fiction. You made it up. And my fiction is made up. I mean, those novels, those things did not happen to me. And it's also true that many of the things in the poems didn't exactly happen to me. And some of them did. When I want to write about something that happened to me or is happening to me, I prefer poetry, because it feels more honest to me. And I don't know why that is exactly, except that it's a sensibility. It's kind of a direction. I prefer it to nonfiction. In nonfiction, I have a lot of maquillage. You know, I want to like put a lot of lipstick on the prose or something. And in poetry, you don't get to do that. So the poetic voice is this very shaved down version, and that makes me feel compelled to admit things. That said, I just want to make a side note, which is that I don't think that Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath are good poets because they wrote confessional poems. I think it's craft, you know, it's still art and it's still artifice. And I'll just finish by going back to your part about rhyme, because in a way, rhyme protects me from what I would feel is a kind of sloppy confession. To me, if there's enough craft in the poem, then the question of whether it's you or whether it happened to you or all the sort of biographical fallacy possibilities and difficulties are set aside so that the poem can be examined as something beautiful and whole and that does its own work in the world that is separate from the work that you in your life have done or not done.
Fantastic.
You're being very brave in this way, by the way.
Thank you both so much. It's now 5 o'clock, so we should probably start wrapping up. But if anyone wants to unmute yourself and say hey to Gail and Rachel before we all go about our evenings, feel free to do so. And definitely check out upcoming events through the University of Chicago Press and through the Seminary Co-op.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great.
Thank you. It's nice to see you.
I want to see the other Gail Mazer.
Thank you, everyone. Gail, it was such a pleasure to hear you read and get to talk with you.
You too. It was great. I hope this happens again soon.
I hope so too.
Okay. So shall we leave?
Feel free to exit yourself at any time and I'll shut the whole thing down in just a second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much.
Adrienne, is there a record of the chat thread? There are a bunch of lovely notes and I can't read the thread while in the conversation.
I'm not sure if there's a record of it, but I can try to just copy and paste this and email it to you.
Copy and paste, but that might be because I'm not the host. If you could copy and paste and send it to us, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, I think I can. I'll try to do that.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yes.
It's
Hey, Rachel, it's not letting me copy this. Sorry.
I couldn't copy it either. And I didn't respond to any of the notes because I couldn't multitask that efficiently.
Oh no, yeah, I know. It's a lot to...
Wait, let me just open it one more time and see if there's some